Hi Nuggets, welcome back. We haven't had a post in a while, but we're gonna have quite a doozy one today. So you have done a great job doing your work during our extended learning period here. I can't tell you how impressed I am by not only the quality of your work, but the fact that we had 100% participation, smoking every other social studies teacher that I know in the level of participation we had in this first assignment. So kudos to you. What we're going to do today is I want to talk about the short answer questions that you worked on, which, by the way, were fantastic. I think you've got really a hold of this short answer format, the style and the way you wrote it. I've read through them all now, and they're all really, really strong. Only a few students missed something, but I just want to review it in general today and go through each one of each component of both short answer questions. So let's start with question one. Question one had a series of answers, obviously, or questions, A, B, and C, that asked about how World War II affected certain subgroups in American culture, the first of which was ethnic minorities. And the two that jump out here are obviously African Americans and Asian Americans. So many of you wrote about how African Americans were faced an opportunity to migrate north, to take these industrial jobs opened up by the war effort. Talked about how jobs that were usually prescribed for white citizens in industry and in business, because of white soldiers fighting overseas, were opened for African Americans to have these jobs. And so they broke out of sort of these service industry jobs and more into these professional careers, and they never looked back. So this was a huge step forward in sort of employment for African Americans in the United States. The other group you can't ignore is obviously Asian Americans, and they perhaps felt World War II the hardest. We all know about the Japanese internment, which wasn't just Japanese, but many Asian Americans that President Roosevelt ordered. Here he argued that it was the Asian Americans offered a clear and present danger to the risk of the United States, sort of employing the rhetoric of Wilson in World War I when he was looking at the Red Scare and the like. FDR orders this. It's a black mark on his pretty good record of civil liberties, but many Americans feared, and rightly so, that the greatest enemy to the United States was the Japanese, and their racism got the better of them, and they interned these Japanese Americans in camps all over the United States, supposedly to protect Americans and American liberties, despite the fact that while doing so, did not protect the liberties of these American citizens who just happened to be Japanese, who were put in these internment camps. The second question, part B, asks about how women were affected by World War II. And obviously, many women were left behind to be leaders of households. And so in this case, they became the pseudo-patriarch and matriarch of many families and many households and had to make do. This gave them an added leadership role, not to mention their role in business, in industry, in places that were usually kept kind of sexually isolated for men, now became open to women as well. And again, just like African Americans enter the workforce, women will never look back. And this will be another step towards women being a part of all levels of employment all across the United States. The last question, part C, asked about the influence or the impact on Native Americans. Native Americans are a really small subgroup here, but the United States military saw them, Native Americans, as a resource in that they had a language that that people of the world didn't speak. Only their languages were only spoken here in the United States. So groups such as the Navajo, they were the most the tribe or the cultural heritage used mostly for this purpose were used as code talkers. It was hard to break their language. Only Navajo could speak to Navajo. Not many people outside the United States spoke these Native American languages, so they played a significant role in writing codes and in communicating between military outfits all throughout Europe and Japan. So that's the first question. The second question asks the role of kind of concepts or ideas during this time. And you'll notice that both questions don't really focus much at all on the war effort, but instead on how the war effort affected us back home. The first question asks, what was the role of industrial production? And this is the component of our discussion that can't be overlooked or can't be even exaggerated enough. America's greatest contribution to World War II is our industrial production, and much of that production happened right here in Metro Detroit. Detroit was very famously referred to as FDR as the arsenal of freedom, and what he meant by this is that our city, with its automotive production and its entrepreneurs and experts and engineers, were crucial to the war effort, not just for the United States, but for all of our allies. So the industrial production of the United States not only supplied the U.S. with an almost unending amount of supplies, but also our allies. And without this, we would not have been able to win the war. At the end, Germany was so strapped for bullets and materials that they had the men to fight. They didn't have the bullets, the guns, the tanks, the ammunition, the rest to do so. And that's one of the reasons they had to capitulate and surrender to the Allies at the end of World War II. The second part is rationing, and rationing kind of has an added kind of connotation to what we're dealing with right now, in that Americans were asked by their government, and in some cases forced to decrease the amount of produce and products and foodstuffs and materials that they were intaking, and to ration them. And this was in a variety of ways. They use rationing with ration stamps, meaning that families would get in this little book. It's usually a green book full of stamps that said you could only get meat so many times a week. To buy meat, you had to go to your butcher or to the grocery store. And if you wanted to buy a pound of hamburger, you had to give them one of your tickets, and you only had so many per week. You didn't use it to buy the good. You used these ration stamps to have permission to buy those goods. But it also came down to people just being more inventive. This is one of the reasons why my grandparents never threw anything away, is because they were taught to reuse things. We do a very bad job of that mostly in our society today. But the people in the 1940s rationed their goods. They saved aluminum foil to be used again. They grew victory gardens so that they didn't have to buy produce from farms. They could grow it themselves. They decided to eat different things that were less perishable, so those goods could be made into foodstuffs to send to the war effort. They used less gas. They started riding their bicycles. They did all sorts of things that provided more materials for the war effort and less for consumer goods. That was the role of rationing during World War II. And the last question asked about the strategy used for using the atomic weapons on the Empire of Japan to end that portion of the war. And there are three main things that you highlighted, and you didn't have to get all of these, you just had to choose one, that highlights the strategy that Truman employed and his generals convinced him of why to use the atomic weapons. First was it would end the war quickly. They felt that an invasion of Japan would amount in an incredible amount, a loss of life, both on the American side and the Japanese side. And many generals argued that by using the atomic weapons on these two spots, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that actually fewer Japanese people would die as opposed to a full-on invasion of the island of Japan. The second was that Truman was very weary of the Russians. And as you know from our earlier studies and from your reading, Russia and the United States had entered into an agreement that said once the war in Europe is over, Russia would help the Americans defeat the Japanese. And Truman didn't want their help. Why? Because if the Russians got to contribute to the war effort in Japan, they would have a say in what happened. And the United States wanted to be in sole control of the peace negotiations. So by ending the war quickly, it prevented the Russians from having a say in the peace agreement and the relationship that Japan would have with the rest of the world post-World War II. The last sort of component of the reasoning behind the use of the atomic weapons was quite frankly a flexing maneuver by Truman and the United States military. Truman warned the Japanese that we have a weapon of immense power and we will use it unless you capitulate, and they didn't. And so at that point, Truman felt that he had to to show what he had, to show his cards. And the use of atomic weapons sent a signal to the rest of the world that the United States is now the superpower, that we have a weapon beyond all imagining that can end wars quickly, and you better watch out. This will dawn the nuclear age and the beginning of the Cold War. This strategy had unforeseen consequences that will lead to basically the rest of period 9, or excuse me, of period 8 and into 9. But guess what? You don't have to worry about that because the College Board, in their immense wisdom, has decided that the AP exam that you will take virtually in your home is not going to cover periods 8 and 9. So this is really where we end. Period 7 ends with the dropping of the atomic weapon. And from here on out, we're going to be basically reviewing our entire year up into this. The rest of this week, we are going to be looking at period 7 as a whole and putting all the connections together and connecting all those dots. And then from here on out, after spring break, we're going to be taking a dive into kind of review. And we'll be doing much as what I had planned to do after spring break, except we won't cover period 8. But don't you worry, kids, because I'm going to make sure that you have a lot of resources if your interest continues into period 8, things you can watch and see and read. Don't worry, it's not Brinkley, about period 8, so that you feel like you get the rest of the story. Anyway, that's a quick review of your short answer. Again, excellent job. Really impressed. Keep up the good work. Check back with Schoology tomorrow for what I'm going to ask you to do next. And we'll have another Flesta Academy video about that as we review period 7. Until then, stay healthy, stay safe, stay smart, and I will see you tomorrow. Thomas, that is not what a bandsaw is used for.